In Brussels, the corridors of the European Union headquarters echo with shock. A founding pillar of Central Europe has broken ranks in a way that no one in the West truly believed possible. Hungary, after years of uneasy membership, has announced it is leaving behind the European Union's orbit to formally join BRICS. For the leaders in Brussels, this is not just a diplomatic setback, it is a political earthquake. The country that once symbolized the EU's expansion into post-Cold War Eastern Europe is now declaring its loyalty to a rival bloc led by China, Russia, and the rising economies of the global South. The decision was not made in haste. Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, has spent years clashing with EU institutions over issues ranging from press freedom to migration policy. But beneath the political fights was a deeper frustration: economics. Hungary's leadership has long argued that Brussels imposed endless rules while delivering little in return. With the EU economy slowing, German industry in decline, and debt crises spreading in the south, Orbán began to look east. What he saw was opportunity. China's Belt and Road Initiative has been pouring billions into infrastructure across Eurasia. Russia, despite sanctions, continues to dominate the energy market for Central Europe. Brazil and South Africa, once distant, now offer agricultural and mining partnerships that Hungary could never secure inside the EU's rigid framework. Joining BRICS was not just a statement of defiance, it was a calculated bet on where the future lies. The symbolism could not be starker. In Beijing, Orbán appeared alongside Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, shaking hands as cameras flashed. Behind them, the BRICS banner gleamed in bold letters, a clear message that Hungary was turning its back on Brussels and choosing a multipolar future. For EU leaders, it was a humiliation. For the United States, it was a warning. Even within Europe, Washington's closest allies are no longer guaranteed to stay in line. The consequences are already rippling through the continent. European banks are bracing for capital flight, as Hungary announces new agreements to settle trade in yuan and rubles rather than euros. Farmers in Hungary, long dependent on EU subsidies, are being promised Chinese contracts for grain exports and Russian guarantees for cheap fuel. Factories that once exported to Germany are now negotiating deals with Indian and Brazilian partners under the BRICS umbrella. This is not just political theater. It is the unraveling of decades of European economic integration. Brussels is furious. Officials speak of sanctions, of cutting Hungary out of EU financial mechanisms, of isolating Budapest diplomatically. But those threats ring hollow when Hungary has already secured lifelines elsewhere. Orbán has calculated that Chinese investment and Russian energy will cover the shortfall, while BRICS membership provides legitimacy on the global stage. Him leaving the EU's suffocating bureaucracy is not a risk. It is liberation. And the timing could not be worse for Europe. With war still raging in Ukraine, with inflation eroding households, and with far-right movements rising across the continent, Hungary's defection sends a dangerous signal. If one member can walk away and thrive, why not others? The global reaction to Hungary's move has been swift. In Western capitals, the sense of betrayal is palpable. Analysts in Washington warn that Hungary's pivot toward BRICS is not an isolated event but part of a wider pattern. Across the global South, nations are looking at BRICS as a platform to escape Western dominance. And now, for the first time, a member of the European Union has joined that wave. The symbolism is devastating. A country once held up as proof of the EU's success story is now proof of its unraveling. For BRICS, the addition of Hungary is a strategic coup. Until now, the bloc was often dismissed in Europe as a coalition of distant economies. But with Budapest in its ranks, BRICS suddenly has a foothold inside the very heart of Europe. This shifts the narrative from being a club of outsiders to becoming a truly global competitor to Western institutions like the EU and NATO. And the impact goes beyond symbolism. With Hungary inside BRICS, new corridors of trade, energy, and finance are being forged that deliberately bypass Brussels. Consider energy. Hungary has long relied on Russian gas to fuel its economy, even as Brussels urged member states to cut ties with Moscow. Now, with BRICS membership, Budapest has formalized its defiance. Russian pipelines will continue to pump energy into Hungary, while Chinese firms invest in expanding infrastructure to make those flows more secure. For Hungary, this ensures stability. For Brussels, it undermines collective bargaining and sanctions regimes designed to isolate Moscow. Trade is shifting as well. Hungary is now negotiating to redirect portions of its exports toward BRICS markets, particularly China and India. Agricultural producers, who once depended heavily on EU subsidies, are being promised access to Chinese supermarkets and Brazilian processing plants. Industrial firms in Budapest are exploring partnerships with Indian tech companies and South African mining groups. These deals may take time to materialize, but the direction is clear. Hungary is no longer looking westward for growth. Financial systems are also being shaken. Hungary's central bank has announced exploratory talks on using the BRICS currency framework for settlements, further weakening reliance on the euro. If implemented, this would represent the first time a former EU state openly adopted BRICS financial tools, setting a precedent that Brussels cannot ignore. Each transaction conducted in yuan, rubles, or a future BRICS digital currency is a small but symbolic strike against the dominance of the euro and the dollar. The geopolitical implications are massive. Hungary's pivot emboldens Eurosceptic movements across the continent. In Italy, France, and even Germany, voices questioning EU bureaucracy and dependence on US strategy are growing louder. Leaders in these countries may not be ready to follow Hungary out of the EU, but the example is powerful. It shows there is life beyond Brussels, and that partnerships with China and Russia are not only possible, but potentially profitable. In Hungary itself, the decision to leave the EU and join BRICS has triggered both celebration and anxiety. Supporters of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán see it as a historic act of defiance, proof that Hungary will no longer be dictated to by bureaucrats in Brussels. State media frames the move as liberation. Hungary, they argue, is finally free to chart its own destiny, backed by powerful allies in the East. Billboards across Budapest highlight images of Orbán shaking hands with Xi Jinping, with captions declaring a new era of sovereignty. For many Hungarians weary of endless disputes with the EU over migration, press freedom, and economic policy, this narrative resonates deeply. But not everyone is convinced. Business leaders tied to European markets warn that leaving the EU's trade framework carries enormous risks. For decades, Hungarian factories have exported car parts, machinery, and electronics to Germany and France, feeding Europe's industrial engine. Those supply chains cannot be replaced overnight. Smaller businesses fear losing EU subsidies that kept their farms and enterprises afloat. Students and professionals worry about the loss of opportunities, visas, and funding that came from European integration. The split has opened a cultural and generational divide. Older voters lean towards sovereignty, while younger Hungarians, many of whom studied or worked abroad, see the departure as a step backward. Across Europe, reactions are equally divided. Eurosceptic parties cheer Hungary's bold move, calling it proof that Brussels is vulnerable and that alternatives exist. Marine Le Pen in France, Matteo Salvini in Italy, and far-right movements in Germany all cite Hungary as a model for resisting EU overreach. Meanwhile, mainstream European leaders warn that Hungary is undermining unity at the worst possible moment. With Russia entrenched in Ukraine, with NATO scrambling to maintain cohesion, and with Europe struggling to secure energy independence, Hungary's defection weakens the bloc from within. In Washington, the mood is one of alarm. Hungary's shift is seen as a breach in the Western Front against China and Russia. For years, U.S. officials viewed the EU as a reliable partner in isolating Beijing and Moscow. Now, a NATO member state is openly siding with them through BRICS. Military planners worry about intelligence leaks and divided loyalties, while economic strategists warn of cracks in the sanctions regime. Hungary may be small compared to Germany or France, but it's symbolic. Defection provides cover for other nations to flirt with the idea of turning eastward. The consequences will not be felt in a single year, but over decades. Hungary's pivot adds momentum to the global trend of multipolarity. Each new deal signed with Beijing or Moscow chips away at the dominance of Western institutions. Each transaction conducted outside the euro or dollar weakens financial control. And each time Hungary presents itself as thriving outside Brussels, it feeds the perception that the EU is not indispensable. For Europe's fragile unity, this perception is perhaps the most dangerous consequence of all.